Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The story. They thought it was just a storm. Then the voices started. The night the breaker lights vanished off Penobscot Bay, the town of Alder's Reach learned the difference between a loud storm and a quiet one. Loud storms shake the windows and slam doors and make you grip your cup a little tighter. Quiet storms move differently. They creep, they insinuate, they convince you in slow inches that the house is breathing with you. That was the kind of storm that came up the coastline in late November of 1997. The kind the old men on the wharf called a gentleman's squall, as if the ocean had wore a dark coat and waited patiently for us to notice the water rising around our ankles. I had driven up from Bangor that afternoon with my tools and a canvas bag and a thermos of the coffee my aunt favored burnt, a little salty, nothing you'd pay for, but perfect for long drives on two-lane roads. I was there to swap out a downed VHF antenna at the lighthouse and check a temperamental weather monitor in the municipal office. The town was small, the roads narrow and fronted by houses that seemed to lean forward as if listening to your tires on the wet asphalt. Cold mist sat heavy enough that your breath felt like it had weight. It smelled like kelp and penny nails and, by dusk, like smoke from every chimney along Harbor Street. Alder's Reach had 2 bars, a post office, and a bait shop that doubled as a hardware store. Down by the ferry slip, men in oilskins were hosing down decks, slapping coils of line into order. A kid on a bicycle was ghosting up and down the empty seawall, the front wheel clicking, clicking, clicking against the uneven granite. I remember thinking that the storm looked undecided, then clouds standing farther out over the water like a crowd unwilling to commit. The air had that electrical feel. Cora Miles always said, warned you when to bring in your wash. Cora was the radio dispatcher at the firehouse and a kingfisher of town gossip. Tall, quiet, with a laugh that took its time to unspool. Give it 2 hours, she told me when I stopped by to pick up the office keys. 2, maybe 3. Then the bay turns to iron. Her brother, a gaunt man named Rook who worked on the dredger in summer and plowed snow in winter, leaned in the doorway behind her like a hinge that had lost its purpose. Or it doesn't turn at all, he said. Sometimes it only pretends. Don't start, Cora said. He gets like this whenever there's low pressure. That's when you can hear things, Rook said. Just saying. I took the keys, signed the underlined line, and promised I'd make it quick. Out beyond the wharf, the day sank. The sky ran in layers, saffron near the horizon, slate above, with a seam where the wind licked the edges together like someone sealing an envelope. The calm was burrowed deep, an old animal too tired to move. I finished with the lighthouse, just as the last light slid off it. The lantern lens stared at me like a clean, indifferent eye. I drove back down the hill, the road slick with a seeping drizzle, and ducked into the municipal building. It had the smell small-town offices, keep the sweet tang of old paper, the scuff of mop water, heat blistering at the edge of a baseboard radiator. The Weatherland monitor sat in a corner with a view of a drab bulletin board and a calendar from a stump-grinding service, its red flip numbers stuck midway between dates. The monitor had been throwing spurious readings for days. It spat them out as if trying to warn us in a language none of us wanted to learn. I opened my bag, took out a flashlight, and loosened the back panel, humming a little to myself to keep the silence company. At that hour, with the ferry dormant and the bars just beginning to collect locals, the building was quiet except for a clock hung over the selectmen's meeting room. Its second hand chewed through seconds the way the ocean chews through polished glass. I found a loose ground, retightened it, cleaned 2 contacts with an old pencil eraser. When I put the back panel on again, the monitor glowed steady. The numbers unclenched, the barometer rising. The wind steady at 9, the sea temperature cooler than you'd like for late November. I signed the log and locked up, standing for a moment under the overhang while the rain thought about becoming rain. I tucked the keys in my jacket pocket, heavy, black metal ones, stamped with a town seal, and stepped into the sort of dark that seems to know your name. When the first gust came, it came without a sound. I only knew it had been there because the air, a second later, bore the deep scent of the Outer Bay cold iron, the breath of something too old to be jealous of us. I walked toward the boarding house I favored when I stayed on jobs out this way, a 3-story Victorian with a deep porch and blue shutters that always looked freshly painted. The owner, a widow named Magda Venn, kept a logbook as if the place were a ship, and she placed the thick, square keys in your palm with a ceremony that made you feel you'd been entrusted with something heavier than brass. "You'll take room 6, she said that night. "There's no view, but I've just put on clean blankets, and the wind doesn't find it so easily." Magda was in her late 60s, with the pale, watchful face of someone who had learned where to leave her words to best effect. She kept a radio on the kitchen shelf, a battered thing that had survived 3 kitchens and 2 husbands, and every night she tuned it to the marine weather. She poured me tea as I watched the green lights of the lobster buoys wink and go out in the chop beyond the seawall. "Storm will straddle us," she said. "We'll get the flanks, and people will act surprised anyway." We ate soup at the long table near the windows. A few other boarders were there, an art teacher named May, who came on weekends to paint boats that looked like dreams boats had about themselves, a lumber hauler called Fitch, whose laugh had a catch in it like a jammed clutch, and a thin-faced man named Peregrine. Stay from Ohio, who had rented a room by the month and spoke like he was afraid someone might steal one of his words if he left it out in the open too long. The storm unrolled itself outside while we pretended not to hear it attiring itself for company. By 10, rain had steadied into a patient drumming. By 11, the wind brought leaves and twigs in low scuttles across the roadway, like creatures invented for the purpose of setting your teeth on edge. The thermostat clicked, clicked, clicked without raising the temperature 1 degree. Later, in room 6, the radiator made ticking noises like an old dog dreaming. I lay on top of the blankets and watched the shadow of the stair banister edge along the opposite wall each time a car passed on Harbor Street. When the power went out, it didn't go with a bang, but with the soft, almost apologetic sigh of a thing that's done all it can do. The generator in the basement thumped twice and then caught. Its hum settled through the house in a low, belly-deep tone you felt more than heard. The window panes spoke in their thin, old glass voices. Somewhere in the hallway, a floorboard answered with a dull, resonant knock. I turned on the small radio I carried out of habit, more a talisman than a tool on nights like this. The NOAA feed was brisk, and even the numbers useful until they weren't. Sometime around midnight, the voices started. It was a moment so simple I almost missed its importance. Like when you reach into a box you think is empty and your fingers find something soft. At first, I thought it was the radio picking up something odd. I had seen storms play tricks before, lifting distant signals along slick layers of air and dragging them onto frequencies they had no business riding. I turned the dial, searching, and then I realized the voices weren't coming from the radio at all. They were coming from the radiator. It was the softest murmur, a wash of vowels with the consonants shaved off, a wash that seemed, if you gave it your attention, to go on breathing, even when you held your own. I leaned forward. The room smelled faintly of iron and old heat, a ghost of every winter warmed in that building. The murmur rose when the generator's hum dipped, as if the voices had to push through machinery, and found a space to do so only when the house exhaled. I got up, held my hand above the radiator's spine. The heat was steady, the metal thinned by years and honest work. The whisper was at the edge of hearing, like someone speaking to you from another room through a door someone had closed carefully. I thought of pipes traveling in good order down through the house and into the basement, and then rising into other rooms where, perhaps, other boarders sat up in their beds with that same look of patient attention. I remembered Rook's upturned face and the way his eyes had wandered, as if following something invisible that moved, not above us, but under the air we all agreed existed. At 12:15, a second sound threaded the first. It was the tap of water, irregular, unhelpful, the metallic syllables of a leak that did not concern itself with your desire to sleep. But between those taps, the murmur hung on, always there, always just behind the next breath. I dozed, sat up, dozed again. Around 2, the generator coughed and settled, and then made that small, alarming change old engines make when they are preparing to remind you of their age. The whisper shifted with it, rising to meet whatever space the machine offered. I told myself every plausible thing. Old vents catching wind, the particular way rain made itself into a voice in houses that had housed too many winters, an electrical field playing tricks with wires I should have replaced when I replaced the antenna. Just before 3, a door down the hall opened with a long, careful groan. Footsteps placed themselves on the runner with ordinary weight. There was a pause outside my door, one I might have imagined, and then the steps continued to the bathroom at the end of the hall. The fan clicked. Water ran. The voices in the radiator thinned, as if the attention that had been turned to my room had been gently redirected. I woke at 8 to pale, foggy light and the smell of coffee strong enough to make a person believe in God. The generator had fallen silent some time after dawn. In the kitchen, Magda stood at the stove. She had the radio turned low and her mouth set in a line that made you want to be useful. Outside, tree branches lay across the sidewalk like dropped arms. A news van crawled past as if embarrassed to be out in daylight. "Water backed up in the street drains," Magda said as she handed me a mug. "We had a man from the town come in the night and say not to worry if the cellars sang. He said it like it happens every storm and like we weren't about to make a whole religion around it." "What time?" "After 2. "What did you hear?" I told her, choosing words as you do when you are trying not to build a cathedral out of lumber that might turn out to be cardboard. Magda listened, her eyes on the old radio, as if it had put itself forward for responsibility. When I was done, she turned and flipped the bacon, then tipped her head toward the back stairs. "Go ask May," she said. "She's been up since dawn, painting the rain spouts, swears they're talking to each other, like old women in a church hall." May smiled as if she had always expected someone to arrive and ask, and now felt vindicated. "Not the spouts," she said. "The traps. The U-bends. The water sits in the bend and makes a little mirror for the voice to look at itself, and then it's not so shy. I heard them around 3. Then at first, then more like a person you were sure you used to know. Words? Yes and no," she said. I could feel the shape of them before I understood any. Then I thought I heard someone say the word lattice. Lattice. I tasted it. It felt ordinary in my mouth until it didn't. "What did you do?" I asked who was there. She looked down at her paint-scarred hands. Foolish, I know, but it felt rude to pretend. And then it was just water. Extremely water. Across the table, Fitch shook his head like someone who had been to the show before and knew the ending would be unsatisfying and was bracing himself for that reality. Peregrine Stay didn't eat. He sat with his long hands around a cup, his knuckles yellow in the kitchen light. "I heard a man," he said in a voice that made the hair on my arms understand a thing before the rest of me did. Just one word, over and over, but it wasn't a word that meant anything by itself. He looked at Magda, then at me. It was a name, the name of a buoy. He told us then about his brother, about the summer of 1987, about a small boat and a squall and a search that had gone on until everyone agreed to stop. "We marked the point by the buoy," he said. "A number like a password you never forget, because forgetting it means the door closes forever." He said it slowly then, and when he did, I heard how a storm and a house and a body that believes in instruments might make a mouth and practice a single syllable until it had no other purpose. I could have spent the day finding reasons. The storm had dropped barometric pressure low enough to persuade old pipes to give up their secrets. The wind had threaded strange pathways through the old bones of this place. The harbor, with its wharf pilings and boat hulls and emptiness where sound should have gone, had made an amphitheater no architect would design on purpose, and we had sat, ears cupped by our own need, and made meaning out of misplaced heat. But that afternoon, standing with Rook on the seawall under a sky as tired and clean as one can be after such a night, I saw something that made my engineering mind flicker and then wait. Workmen were clearing the drains along Harbor Street. A truck bearing the town seal idled with that throat-clearing cough old diesels have. One of the guys, a stout man in an orange slicker with reflective strips down the sleeves, banged the grate with a short-handled bar. Another, kneeling, peeled purposefully at the mat of leaves and needles and stray wrappers that had made a lid over the mouth of the street's throat. When the clog broke and the trapped water rushed in, it made a sound I had not heard before. Not a roar, not a gurgle. A long, low rush with a pitch to it, the exact pitch, if I am honest, of someone saying a name slowly to themselves so they wouldn't forget it. Rook looked at me. He had the look of a man whom you've caught not exactly cheating, but certainly stacking the deck a little. Told you, he said. Sometimes quiet storms bring quiet passengers. He told me then about other nights, the storm in 1979, when the phone lines had broken and residents swore they could hear the lines speaking to each other between poles. The winter in 1963, when the church bell sounded out a hymn nobody claimed to know. Nobody wants to remember those years, he said. You can smell the fear on them, even when they tell you it was just a trick of air. He squinted at the harbor, where the water had gone sour, green, and gentle. We make our houses out of wood and heat, and the idea that we're inside, safe. The bay makes everything else out of salt. Sometimes the inside and the salt have a conversation. That should have been the end of it. We had a storm, we had a night, we had a rumor and a sensible explanation willing to be our friend. I replaced the office keys with Cora, who asked me to write down anything that might be useful in the event of someone in Boston wanting to ask. I went down to the bait shop and bought rubber gloves and a small wrench I did not need. I ate chowder at the bar and let the low murmur of ordinary talk swaddle me. I packed up my tools and stood in the boarding house hallway at dusk, and that was when I noticed the thing that changed how I thought about the voices. The thermostat was a small beige rectangle. I hadn't looked at it twice the night before. Now it had one of those needle sliders, move it right, the house warms, left, it cools. The faint pencil mark below the 20 were old, greasy with years of fingers. The slider sat at a point between two marks that had no business between them. And the thin wire that disappeared into the wall had a hitch in it, just a slight, neat loop that had not been there the day before. I would have sworn it. I would have bet the cost of my tools. I knocked on Magda's kitchen door. Someone's been in the walls? She wiped her hands on a towel that had been washed 1,000 times and leaned in the doorway to look where I pointed. Only thing that travels in there is heat and mice, she said, and I checked for both. I'm not saying I began. She looked at me in a way that stopped me. No, you're saying it. There was something like gratitude in her voice. You're saying the part people will pretend they didn't hear when they tell this story to their neighbors 2 streets over. She told me about the first time she'd heard the radiator speak the winter after her husband died, when she woke to the smell of smoke and a sound like someone calling from the cellar. I went down in my robe, she said, and the boiler was red as a mouth. The man at the shop said if I'd slept another hour, we'd have had ourselves a different story. She turned back to the sink. I say thank you when it happens. That's all. On the way out of town, the road felt newly paved with the same tar, the same grit, but another layer had been laid under it, one I could not name. The mist rose in the breaks between the spruces, like breath coming off a sleeping animal. I passed the cemetery, where the stones had turned their pale backs to the road, and the gas station, where the pump bell chimed for no reason I could see. I left Alder's Reach with the radio on and the heater set too high, and the feeling that I had been given a story that did not want to be told straight. I went back twice that winter. Once for a new relay in the firehouse siren, once for a loose bracket on the school roof that had learned how to ring itself when the wind was just so. Each time I stayed at Magda's. Each time the house greeted me with the same practical warmth. Each time, at some hour, the body is supposed to trust the world, the house leaned slightly nearer to itself and made room for a sound. It was never clear. It never gave me the comfort of comprehension. But sometimes there was the shape of a word. Sometimes there was a laugh, like you hear in your dream, when you've already begun to wake. Once, in February, the kind of night where the stars are so brittle you feel guilty for looking at them, I heard what could only be described as a song, not sung exactly, but held, like a light cupped in 2 hands. On that February night, I got up and went downstairs. The house had that stillness that tells you everyone in it is awake and pretending not to be. I stood in the entry and watched the door like a dog, listening for a car half a mile away. I passed my hand an inch from the door's surface and could feel the cold coming through where the wood had learned to be thinner. The storm wasn't loud. The snow fell with the hush that makes you think big thoughts. I put my ear to the wood because sometimes that's what you do. For the length of a held breath, I heard what sounded like the sea moving through a tighter place than it liked. A place made for it, perhaps, but not by it. When I straightened, the hall clock, one of those with a pendulum and a patience you could set your life against, ticked over to 3:17. The next morning, at breakfast, Peregrine told me he had dreamed of his brother for the first time in years. He was young, he said, and annoyed with me because I'd put something where he could not find it. He kept telling me I had to look under the deck for the lattice, he said, and stopped. His mouth set. I woke up with a piece of his jacket in my hand. It was impossible, but there it was. Then I realized it was only the napkin I'd fallen asleep with. After the snow, Alder's Reach shrank for a while into a small, winter-hard knot of lives bound together by the roads that stayed plowed and the ones that didn't. The voices became part of the checks, one made before bed, windows latched, stove off, pipes not singing too loudly. A boy down on Dock Street claimed the drain in his shower had told him where his father had hidden a roll of bills. He found the money, and for a week, his mother left a bowl of fresh water by the tub, as if the house might get thirsty. A woman whose husband had been on the ferry the year the cable snapped swore she heard his name in the elevator's slow groan. You can think I'm soft in the head, she told Cora, who told me, but I know my own. When spring came, it came in one day, the way it does sometimes suddenly, as a hand placed gently on the back of your neck. The snow went gray and thin and tired. The moorings showed themselves like old bones coming up through the sand. The boatyards stank pleasantly of paint and cedar dust. I came back once more to tune the school's new intercom. The boarding house had its windows open and smelled like lemon oil, and the inside of the first cupboard you open after a long winter. Magda had a pie cooling on the sill. You'll hear nothing tonight, she said. They prefer to ride on the low air. That evening, I walked down to the seawall by myself. The bay wore its ordinary face, again little furrows, slate on slate. I stayed until the last of the walkers had gone home, and the orange lamps along Harbor Street had melted the edges of the shadows. The grate over the nearest drain shone wet and black. I crouched and looked at it the way you look into the opening of a place you could not fit your body into, only your hand. This is what I saw. My own face, still, in the thin skin of water that lived just below the grate. The face of a man who had not slept enough and had slept well anyway. Behind it, a darkness that was not simply dark, but layered, the way the sea is layered when you take a cross-section and discover there is a slope to the currents you did not earn the right to know about. I watched until my breath fogged the air and made it possible to pretend I had seen something else. And then I stood, and the water settled itself. And in the settling, it made the smallest sound and intake of breath, almost, but as if it had remembered at the last second that it was supposed to be water and not a voice at all. I didn't tell anyone about that moment. I drove home and went back to the work that is as good as any other work. The world obliged me with other storms, other towns, other nights when a generator took on the role of heart with convincingly human anxiety. I have not set foot in Alder's Reach in years. But sometimes, late, I turn off my own radio and listen to the heater in my apartment doing its job. I could make a list of what pipes can do when you are tired. I could enumerate. I could instruct. But after all this time, it is not instruction that stays with me, nor any conclusion that a sensible person might hang on their wall. It is the small, ordinary confidence with which something not human found the path from one space to another and used it not to frighten, but to be heard. It is the steady way Magda handed me a mug as if this were the most natural thing. It is Cora's pencil line under the date where she wrote, "Voices reported in multiple homes," as if it were a line about a stray dog found on Stone Cut Lane. It is Peregrine saying the name of a buoy and feeling at last, that someone else might remember it with him. The last time I checked, the buoy he named had been replaced with a new one, same number, new hull, a different tongue for the bell. The sea speaks in brass and salt there now, as if that could make a difference. If you go to Alder's Reach on a gray day, you will think you're simply visiting a small town that has learned how to hold still. You will see a woman sweeping a porch and a man backing his truck into a tight space. You will smell bait and coffee and the metallic breath the bay exhales when rain is coming. If you lean close to the drains along Harbor Street, people will think you're odd, and you will be, but only in the way people are when they are trying to hear something that does not insist. And if, on a quiet night with the wind down and the air hung low, the radiator in your rented room begins to murmur, it will not be a story demanding a shape. It will be a name, perhaps not yours, perhaps not anyone's, spoken not to you, but near you. You will stand very still and think of lattice, of buoys with passwords, of the moment a house makes a mouth. You will feel the heat rise against your hand. You will not, if you are wise, tell it to stop. You will listen as if you are the person someone has been looking for. And then, as happens in towns like this, the sound will thin, as if the traveling it did took something from it, and leave you with a room that is just a room, a town that is only itself and the kind of quiet that feels earned. The story. The house that whispered their names before they spoke. They moved in on a Thursday in late October, the kind of day when the air feels thinned out and the light seems to come from the side rather than above. The family was small and trying to be smaller while they figured out the shape of a new life. Bram, who repaired obsolete cameras for a living and didn't talk much unless he had to, Odile, who taught music at the community college and kept notes in a small cloth book that never left her pocket, and their son, Calder, 6 years old, serious and sensitive, counting his steps as if each one needed permission from the floor. The house, a gabled salt box on the northern edge of Ashford Hollow, Massachusetts, had been empty for a year. It sat back from the road like someone listening, set among lopsided birches and a low stone fence that broke apart and came back together again 30 yards down. The realtor's brochure said the house dated to 1941 with later additions, that the wiring had been updated and the well flushed, that the floors were fir and the attic full height. It did not mention that the house had a habit of speaking. Not in words exactly, at least not at first. But in the way certain places do, when you sense you're being watched and know you're not, when a door eases shut with a mild and inexplicable certainty the moment your back is turned. The house had a way of being there, just a little ahead of them. They noticed names on the first night. Bram was hauling a final box up the stairwell, the kind of box that always seems heavier than its contents warrant, full of wires that don't belong to anything and notebooks whose meaning has died, when he noticed a strip of brittle masking tape on the wall. The tape ran along the baseboard like a tiny road, turning at the corner in a neat right angle, and at the end of it, in thin blue lettering, someone had written a word he didn't recognize. Not a word, a name. Odile. He thought of his wife downstairs, in the kitchen with the box of glassware, humming a line from a lullaby she used to sing when Calder was smaller. The penmanship was careful, a lean script composed like the notes on her cloth book. He touched the tape. It lifted cleanly under his nail, only to tear soundlessly when he tugged with real intent, like it had decided to be part of the wall. He carried the box the rest of the way up, set it in the narrow room under the dormer, and told himself it was nothing more than a trick of coincidence. Old houses, old lives, old habits of labeling the world. He made a note to peel off any other labels before Odile saw them. Then he found the second one, at the top of the stairs, tucked behind the newel post like a child hiding and trying not to be seen. BRAM, in the same blue script. He did not tell her. He told himself he would tell her when he had an explanation and not a feeling. Odile found her own label anyway. She was lying flat on the scuffed kitchen floor, arm jammed beneath the oven, trying to reach a metal rattle that had rolled too far, when her fingers came away sticky with dried adhesive and paper. She pulled out a strip of tape, the color of tea, light catching it just so, and held it up to see it better. Odile, written small as if spoken in a whisper. They stood up together without speaking and stepped away from the oven like it might say something next. They didn't tell Calder, who was building a city out of folded packing paper in the living room and inviting the wind from the open door to be its river. Sleep did not come easily. The house welcomed them with the noises of pipes settling into their winter routine and a wind that knew the angles of the gables by heart. There was a click from the baseboards that might have been the hydronic system switching on, and a sigh from the old storm windows that might have been nothing, and the thin rasp of a tree's fingertip across the slate roof. Odile's breathing found a rhythm that Bram could fold into his own, and then there was the whisper of the label under the oven, sliding around in his head like the metal rattle she never could reach. They made it to morning. And in the sunlight that is not sunlight, the light of late October that belongs more to smoke than to day, the house seemed ordinary again. Calder wanted oatmeal with a spoon that didn't feel too cold. Bram coaxed the valve on the old percolator and watched coffee advance with a kind of grainy determination. Odile stood in the doorway and looked at the birches, thin as wrists, and thought of a composition she had started and abandoned in a different life. The first time the house said a name out loud was the second day. It did not do this in a theatrical way. There was no hand of God in it, no frost on the mirror reminding anyone of anything. Odile was in the cellar, inventorying shelves that smelled of old apples and damp rope, when the pull string on the single hanging bulb began to sway. It clicked the bulb off, then on. A toy sound. Then it stopped. Only when she climbed the stairs and opened the cellar door did she realize the kitchen radio was on, though neither she nor Bram had turned it on. It was an old unit mounted beneath the cabinet, a rectangular face with a dial like a clock and a speaker net that sagged on one side. The house had come with it, along with the attic fan and a box of unsorted keys. The radio had been silent since they moved in. Now, from the speaker, in the static between stations, a single word rose up as if someone had walked into a room on the far side of a wall and said it without thinking. Calder. It came soft and incomplete, more breath than sound, the edges of the name muddy with interference. But it was the name, and the boy coming in from the yard with leaves on his jacket turned when he heard it. He didn't look afraid. He looked surprised, then pleased in the way children are pleased when a thing outsiders call luck feels to them like recognition. He walked to the radio and said hello, then waited. The speaker gave him back a sigh and went quiet. Bram unplugged the radio and set it aside. He found a second strip of tape on the underside of the cabinet and peeled it off, though only halfway. The tail of it would not come free, no matter how patiently he pulled. It read, in the same blue script, Calder's name plus a date. Not the date they had moved in. An old date from a winter decades ago. They did not return the keys. They did not call the realtor. The house had taken on the density of a secret, and secrets grow heavier the more you try to hand them to someone else. They met a neighbor on the third morning. He came walking up the drive with the posture of someone balancing an invisible tray, careful and focused, as if something might slide if he hurried. His name was Lyle Norcross, and he had the look of a man who had not found a good reason to leave and had therefore learned to be very good at staying. He asked if they were settling in, and Bram said yes, and Odile said mostly, and Calder asked if he had any cats, which he did not. They took their coffee to the back stoop. The stone still held a little warmth. Lyle gestured toward the birches and said they'd fall the first real storm, that he'd come help with the cutting if Bram didn't mind a blunted chain or two. He said the previous owners had left quietly. He said the road was mean after dark when the frost came up from the dirt. Then he looked at the house like someone looking at a person trying to decide how long to hesitate before prying into an intimate part of their life. You found the labels, he said. It wasn't a question. Odile asked what he meant. He nodded at the kitchen window. The afternoon light caught the glass in such a way that they could see their own faces reflected in a loose triangle in the pane, as if the house wanted to introduce them to the house. Lyle said the labels would be everywhere if they looked. He said they'd be accurate more often than not. He said the woman who lived here before them kept a list of visitors on the pantry door, left of the flour bin, and that he'd be grateful if they left it there. It made him feel like people didn't disappear entirely when the road decided to keep them. They found the pantry list after he left. The pine door had been sanded thin and then stained back to its middle age, and in the center, someone had written a series of names and dates in pencil. The graphite had pressed just deep enough into the grain to be legible even where the wood had darkened with oil. It was not a guest book. It was more like a ledger of the house's fidelity. Judith and Rafe, Mr. Lynn, Little Nora, a teamster whose name had fallen out, the Adams boys, Darlene, Father Keene, the Norcross kids. Some names had asterisks, some were underlined twice, some had nothing but a date. Then there was a blank space, and after that, on the far right margin, as if shy of being seen, 3 names written lightly and close together. Bram, Odile, Calder. The pencil line under those names had not been put down with a human hand. It was too perfectly even, and it did not pick up a single splinter of wood, but slid like a shadow across summer light. The date was not the date they arrived, it was the date they had decided, with the tired excitement of people who had made compromises and were still hopeful they counted as choices. Odile put her fingers lightly on the door and felt nothing but the cool of the wood. Bram said that someone could have broken in while the house sat empty and written them in, that the county records were public, and anyone who cared could have learned their names. It was a sensible explanation, and it made them both feel smaller, which is how sensible explanations sometimes work. They tried to live the way families do. Bram set up his workbench in the narrow room under the dormer, lined up broken cameras, and made neat piles of small screws. Odile hung her keyboard in the parlor and placed a folding chair just so, softening the corner with a blanket she didn't mind ruining with dust. Calder found a low vent in the hallway with a grid you could take off and a space you could talk into and hear yourself again a second later, like the house was giving him back his own voice. The days took on a slow rhythm, the way a swing's motion does, hesitant at first, then inevitable. The house did not stay quiet. It did not get loud either. It kept doing what it had been doing for who knows how long. Calder would hear his name in the click before the porch light caught, or in the sigh the water heater made when it decided to wake. Odile would set a kettle on, and before the water moved a muscle, hear the ghost of a tone in the coils that matched a note she'd been practicing upstairs. Bram would come home from town and find a greasy thumbprint on the storm door that fit his own without question, even though he'd wiped the glass that morning. There were other names, they happened here and there, never where you expected, like glass marbles in a field. A voice in the static of the unplugged radio saying, "Clear as a line on paper, Nora." A pencil stub rolling off the pantry shelf and landing under the broom with the word Darlene pressed into its soft wood. The answering machine, an actual one, with cassettes filling with silence, then with a man's breath, then with a single whispered Rafe, and then nothing more. The names did not frighten Calder. He compiled them, as children do, in a private catalog whose categories were his own. He told Odile that Nora sounded young and liked the window light. He told Bram that Mr. Lynn was a careful listener who waited by the water, though no one in their family had a lake. He asked if he could put milk out on the stoop for a visitor who never came. When Odile asked who, he said the house would know, and she let it be. In the middle of November, a storm came, early and decisive. It put the birches down like tall grass and sent the road stumbling toward the swamp. The power failed before supper and did not return until just before dawn. They ate in the living room by candlelight, keeping the stove door cracked to borrow what heat it could spare. Bram told Calder a story about a camera that could see what you would forget, and Odile hummed the shape of a song she could not yet play. When the candles sank low, Calder asked if he could sleep under the piano. Odile made him a little nest with a quilt folded in thirds and a pillow that smelled like cedar. The storm eased into a slow rain. The house settled, glad in an old way to be lit by fire and not by wire. Within that quiet, and in the rhythm of the rain, a small voice said a name from somewhere in the room where no mouth was. Odile. It wasn't their Odile, it was the name and not the person. Somehow, the sound of a thought that had been stored and then retrieved. Bram held still and kept his voice steady and asked Calder if he had spoken, and Calder said he had not. Odile felt something like recognition and didn't know of what. The next morning, the yard looked rearranged. The birches lay down in a tangle, quiet and relieved, and the stone fence had given up and gone to pieces. Bram and Lyle cut the downed trees into lengths that would split well come spring. Lyle said this was what the place did, that it took whatever came with a shrug and made a use for it. He put down his saw and asked them, with the care of someone who is about to place a thin glass thing on a slippery table, if the names were getting to be too much. He said he didn't mean to pry and he didn't want to scare the boy, but he remembered that winter when the names had come thick and quick, and he'd watched his own mother stand in front of the pantry door and read them like a prayer. She had read his father's name the week before the accident in the quarry. It had steadied her or made her crazy, depending on which of his sisters you asked. People have their theories, he said. Some say the house keeps echoes the way a cave keeps drips. Some say there's iron in the ridge that makes the wires talk. Once, a man from the college tried to check the place for voltage and left early in the afternoon with a look on his face like he'd misplaced a word he'd been using since childhood. Odile asked if the names ever came ahead of the person. Lyle said they did once in a while in a way you could argue about. You'd hear a name, then meet a person with that name at the post office the next day, and you'd wonder if the house had suggested them to you or if the town was small and names repeated themselves, because that's how life works when you run out of room to move. Winter set in, the kind you feel in your teeth. They learn the roads as a family learns the lines of a face, favoring the route that lifted them over the marsh rather than sunk them into the ruts near the quarry. Calder learned the difference between careful silence and worried silence. Odile taught students who either came through the snow cheerful and red or wrote to say the bus had disappeared under them. Bram found ways to keep his fingers warm enough to pick up screws without sending them into the slits between the floorboards. The house kept speaking, not always in English, sometimes in the grammar that belongs to a place. Across a week in January, a single hinge upstairs would click each evening and then not click again, and in that single click, Bram would hear his own name bent into a shape that fit. Odile would walk into the parlor, and the keyboard would be one note sharp, just one, and when she tuned it down, the room felt grateful. Calder would go out to fetch wood and know, somehow, that the first 3 pieces would be damp, the 4th would hiss, and the 5th would take flame, as if it had been waiting for him since spring. Then one night, a deep cold, a week before the light begins to shift back towards spring, the house said a name none of them knew. It said it in a voice that was all air and no throat, in the pause that comes when you switch a lamp off and darkness arrives a fraction sooner than you expected. The name was Isola. Calder repeated it like a question. Odile stood still and felt the name pass through her like a draft. Bram wrote it down. They asked Lyle the next day if anyone by that name had lived nearby. He said not that he knew. He said it sounded like a word that forgot it wasn't a name, or a name that forgot it was once a word. 2 days later, a postcard arrived in their mailbox with a picture of a place none of them recognized, blue water, a narrow bridge, a slumped wall, and a message for Calder in block letters that looked like they had been shaped by someone unused to writing. The simple sentence said that the house would keep them if they kept the house. It was signed Isola. Bram carried the card inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and felt the edges of his life threaten to lift. He flipped the card and looked at the postmark. It was from a town he did not know how to pronounce, far down the coast, and dated a week before they had moved. He did not show Calder the postmark. He did not show Odile until later that night when the house had taken on its winter creaks and he was willing to meet the strangeness with his back straight. They decided, without saying it, that they would not go hunting for Isola. They would not turn the name into a problem to be solved, because problems demand endings and the house did not feel like it wanted one. They kept the card in the cloth book Odile carried, tucked between a line of notes and a recipe for a broth her grandmother had taught her by feel. Spring made promises it kept. The marsh threw up a thin green. The birch stumps wept sap. Lyle and Bram split the stormwood under a sky the color of light through milk. Calder took to exploring the field behind the stone fence, finding bottle glass and iron hooks, and once a length of chain so old the metal flaked from his hands like bark. He brought his finds to the porch and lined them up by size, naming them when he could. He named the hook Rafe because it felt useful and tired. He named the glass Nora because it let more light through where it was thin. He held the chain in both hands and said Isola out loud, then put it back where he found it out of a feeling he couldn't explain. One afternoon in May, a car pulled into the drive and stayed there with the engine off, the kind of waiting that means thinking. A woman stepped out slowly and stood as if she were counting swallows. She was in her 60s, wearing a coat even the day did not require, and she had the look people get when they cross a river they cannot see. Odile went out to meet her. Bram watched from the parlor, not out of distrust, but the way one watches a pot on the stove whose lid has begun to pop. The woman's name was Darlene. Odile knew before she said it. The name had been written on the pantry door in that careful ledger. Darlene said she had lived here once, a long time ago when she was younger, and the house felt taller. She said the spring frogs used to sing in the ditch deeper than they do now, and the attic had been warmer than it had a right to be in winter. She asked if she could see the pantry. They let her. She stood before the door, a little to the left, and read her name as if tasting it to be sure it had not gone flat. She moved her finger down the list. Judith and Rafe, Mr., Lynn, Little Nora, and then touched the three names written light and close on the right margin. Bram, Odile, Calder. She said the house always did that when it liked a family, writing them lightly, as if testing whether they would become permanent. Darlene stayed for tea and told them a story about Isola. Years ago, she said, a man had come down the road in late autumn with a pushcart piled high with sheet music and vegetables and a bird cage without a bird. He said his name in a low voice, and she, hearing it through the storm door, had thought he said Isola. He had stayed 3 nights in the lean-to where she kept kindling, thanking the house every morning as if it had given him a room and not a roof with a hole in it. On the second morning, he had stood at the pantry door and written a name she could not see until winter when the cold brought it out. It wasn't his, she said. It was hers, in the exact blue script the labels used. After he left, the radio would hum at odd hours and say Mr. Lynn in the same hum. She never did learn his name the right way. Darlene left before rain, promising nothing and asking for nothing, just as a person does who believes the world to be more complicated and more kindly than it seems. She touched the door frame lightly on her way out, and Bram saw the way her hand slowed, as if the wood had said something in passing she didn't want to miss. By summer, the house felt unmistakably like theirs. The garden threw up tomatoes that tasted like the sun burned on the tongue. Calder packed his own backpack for day trips to the creek, filling it with a book of birds he never opened and a tin of crackers that always came home empty. Odile spoke to her students about tension and release, about how notes fail if you don't let them be what they want to be before you ask them to be what you want. Bram took a camera that had spent 30 silent years and tuned it until he could listen through it to the way light lies. The names didn't stop, but they found their place. Sometimes they were a comfort, like being called in from the yard by someone who knows you're not ready to come in but cares to ask anyway. Sometimes they were unsettling, like hearing your own footsteps lag a fraction after you. They never became background noise. Late one evening in September, the year turning toward its old shape, Bram woke to a sound that was not a sound. It was the shape of someone saying a name, the hush of a mouth closing around a vowel, then letting it go. He lay still and let the room piece itself back together. Odile stirred and slept again. Down the hall, Calder sighed, a little boy noise gone soft with sleep. Somewhere in the house, something said Bram in a way that belonged to tomorrow. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't comforting either. It was a suggestion. He got up and went to the pantry. The house was the kind of quiet that makes your hearing better. He put his hand on the door and looked where the pencil marks lay. Under their 3 names, in the margin where the house liked to write the light things, a 4th name had appeared. He stood very still, and the stillness had weight. The 4th name was a name they had not yet said out loud because, for a year, they had been careful with the future. They had not planned on more, not after the first child and the house that somehow felt full in a way that had nothing to do with space. But the house had written it softly anyway, as if afraid of scaring it away. He read it once, then stepped back. Odile came to stand beside him. She did not ask why he was there. She looked at the door and saw it, and her hand found his. In the light that was only light if you were generous, the pencil line under the new name was so faint you could miss it, and in that faintness, there was an invitation to forgive the past its edges. They didn't say anything the next day. There was a list of small tasks, and lists are one of the ways a person gets through the days when they know something and are waiting to know it more completely. Calder played in the field and came back with a yellow leaf he said was shaped like a fish. Odile cut vegetables and added salt and tasted and added nothing more. Bram changed the screen out for the storm window and tried not to imagine the future arriving like an unexpected car in the drive. The appointment came 2 weeks later, in a building with too much glass, the kind that makes a person feel like they're being watched by the sky. The technician's voice was practical in a way that can be mistaken for coldness and is sometimes only a hedge against the weather of other people's lives. The first image was shadow and grain, the second had a shape, the third had a suggestion. Odile's face softened the way faces do when something that might have been is also something that might not be. The technician said a few measured words. They left in the kind of quiet that belonged to waiting rooms and winter and drove back along the marsh where water lay the color of old mirror. They didn't tell Calder yet. He accepted the world as it arrived and never demanded more than he could carry. The house knew before they did. Not in any way that would make a good story. Not with thunder or rattling windows. It knew in the way it held its warmth differently at night, keeping it closer to the floors where small feet travel. It knew in the length of time the water heater would wait before it came on, as if letting someone sleep a little longer. A week after the appointment, Odile woke to the smallest sensation. A weightlifting that seemed like nothing until it was everything. They went to the hospital and came home before sunset. There was not much to say. The word for what happened was as old as weather and as private as breath. Bram stacked wood he did not need to stack. Odile made tea she did not drink. Calder watched his parents in the careful way of children who can tell when an adult has put a hand on the wall to steady themselves and is pretending they meant to do that. That night, after Calder was asleep, Odile stood before the pantry door. The house was quiet in a way that had no past in it. She looked at the new name in the margin and spoke at once, softly, as if reading something aloud to make sure it was real. It did not change. It did not vanish. She touched her fingers to the wood and felt its smoothness, the place where the palms of hands had burnished it for 80 years, and she did not ask the house for anything. In the morning, the light came as if it had been waiting a little way down the road and walked in when it was sure it wouldn't interrupt. They made breakfast. Calder asked about the word written in the margin. He had not asked before. Perhaps he thought it belonged to a surprise. Odile told him it was a name the house liked, that sometimes the house liked names the way people do and held them close for a while. Calder said the name and listened. The radio was unplugged, the vents were quiet, the house said nothing, which, if you have ever lived in a place long enough, you know is a way of saying something too. The seasons turned again, because they always do. The birches sprouted from the stumps and made another attempt at sky. Lyle came by with seed and stories and sat with Bram on the stoop in the hour that does not belong to day or night. Odile played in the parlor with the windows open, letting the music walk outside and then return a little changed. Calder learned to whistle and forgot how, and learned again. The names continued, not less, not more, just there. A soft rafe in the table when Bram put his elbows down. Mr. Lynn in the small hum the refrigerator made before the motor caught. Nora in the bright strike of a spoon on a bowl, Isola on windless afternoons when the curtains shifted anyway, perhaps saying a word to themselves for the pleasure of it. On the first snow of the new winter, Calder went outside with his breath big in the air and came back with a handful of quiet he opened over the kitchen sink. He looked up at the pantry door and said he thought the house had learned his laugh. Odile said she thought it had too. Bram said he hoped it would keep teaching them theirs. That night, after dishes and after wood and after the steady click of the thermostat appointing the hours, Odile stood at the door again. The new name remained. It did not accuse, it did not promise. It lay there light and certain in the place where the house recorded what mattered to it. She put a finger on the grain and felt steady. She did not ask the house to change, and it did not. It was past midnight when the house spoke for the last time that week. Bram was not asleep, not exactly, and Odile had the calm exhaustion of a person who has done the day honestly. From somewhere in the wall, from the weave of wire and timber that made the house itself, a voice said a name. The name was Bram's, and then Odile's, and then Calder's, and then the light name, the one written softly in the margin. The voice put them one after another like stones on a path, and then it was quiet. No thunder, no creak, no coda. In the morning, there were rabbit tracks by the fence and a bright patch of sky where the clouds had not noticed they were supposed to be working. Lyle's footprints met theirs halfway down the drive, and all the tracks together looked like a story that did not mind being read out of order. Odile poured coffee and looked at Bram and felt the way a room feels when someone you love walks into it and the light shifts, not because the weather changed, but because the shape of the space did. They kept the labels they couldn't peel without tearing the paint. They let the radio live in its place, though it spoke as often as it didn't. They tended the ledger on the pantry door with a tenderness you reserve for objects that somehow hold a piece of you didn't know how to name. They added no marks and erased none. The house held their names, and the names held them back in the way memory does when it is kind. If you ask them today, if you happen to be driving through Ashford Hollow in a thin and slanted light, if you stop to ask directions and find yourself invited to sit on the stoop and take a warm cup into your cold hands, they will tell you the house never did anything but what any house can do when it has been lived in a long time by people who used each other's names with care. It learned the sounds and carried them forward. It remembered, it reminded. It made a place where a person could say a word softly and hear it returned, sometimes altered, sometimes the same, always theirs. And if you are quiet, if you let the air slow, you might hear it too, the way the stair gives a little before it takes you, the way the kettle knows when to sing your name and when to let the room be still, the way a pencil line written in a light hand can hold steady through weather and seasons and the smooth weight of a palm. You might hear a name you recognize or one you do not. Either way, it will feel like being called in, gently, by a voice that never had a mouth and never needed one, a voice that knows you without asking and asks nothing in return. When you leave, because everyone leaves, for a little while or for good, you will shut the door and the latch will catch with the softest click, like a breath being taken. On the other side of the wood, the house will hold the names the way a field holds light. Not tightly, not possessively, but thoroughly. And somewhere in its small geography, between the wire and the wood, between the kitchen hum and the pantry grain, a pencil line will wait, calm as winter sky, for the next hand to belong there.